Welcome back to Crafted Reality, a podcast by Yellow Brick. In this episode, we welcome back Ian Thomas, who you may remember from our previous episode on LARPing. This time, we talk with Ian about his work as a writer, narrative designer, and games programmer who's blended interactivity and storytelling for nearly 3 decades. He's worked in interactive television, education, puppet making, film, publishing, and the games industry, and has contributed code and writing, or even design to more than hundreds of titles. So, without further ado, let's get stuck in. Welcome back. Thanks for joining us again. This time we're going to shift a little bit from talking about LARPing, which is what we talked about in the last episode, to some of the stuff that you do as your full-time job. I was going to say real work, but that's just not. As my mum, I think, would probably say, in your proper job.
Yeah, the one that you get paid for and don't give out money for. Yeah, instead.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about what you do in terms of your day job.
Sure. So I've worked in the computer games industry for quite a long time now. My current role is that of narrative director at a company called the Chinese Room in Brighton, but I'm here in Stockholm. And I guess the simplest way to describe that is the narrative director is, in theory, in charge of the story, however that story is delivered in a computer game. And there are all sorts of ways to deliver story. It's not just words, obviously, it's pictures, audio, all of those sort of things. So yeah, the how does the player understand the story and how does the player affect that story is my job.
And tell us a little bit about the path to get into becoming that role, which it seems like kind of quite unique. Yeah, tell us how your journey to get into where you are now. Nice easy question for you.
Yeah, no, it's fine. It's like almost every role in computer games, there is no real fixed path to it. Everybody gets into it in a different way. Personally, I started out as a programmer and then did a whole bunch of work in multimedia, interactive TV, crossing lots of different disciplines. I started out in a cartoon studio, actually, in Cardiff. And then I did mainstream programming for computer games, so programming on the gameplay systems, how players would run and jump and hit and build Lego blocks and that kind of thing for things like the Lego games. But in my spare time I was creating LARPs, writing stories, helping out with films, writing books, and it basically got to the point where the day job was programming for 8 hours or more, and then I was making things up for about another 8 hours of a day, and it didn't really fit anymore, so I decided I'd try and collapse those two things. So it's taken a bunch of years, but I have mostly migrated away from the coding. It's useful for me to have that under my belt, and I still use it day to day for particular things about the logic of how stories interact with each other, or creating pipelines for our teams to be able to put content into the games, so I still get involved in that. But most of my job these days is hands off on that stuff and all about making story happen and helping teams make story happen.
Is there a difference between making stories for LARPs, which is what we kind of interviewed you and Rachel about last time, to making stories for computer games?
There is a big difference, but there are also a load of similarities which are interesting. A load of the stuff that I took out of LARP design and tabletop design and game running actually applies really well in computer games. The sort of traditional path, I suppose, for storytellers often is into either creating books or film, TV, radio. And those stories are stories that you are telling people, and the people are the audience for those stories. The difference for LARP and RPGs and computer games is that the player is not just the audience, or shouldn't be. The player is an active participant. The player has agency. And so the key difference between computer games and almost any other medium, apart from, as I said, LARP, is that the player's viewpoint has to be front and central, and the player has to feel, or should feel, involved in pushing the story forward. It's not true of every game. In some cases you are acting as an audience, or you are uncovering a story bit by bit, and the level of connection and involvement varies game to game, but mostly we start by thinking about the player first. Now, the difference between it and LARP is that a LARP is reactive to a single or group of actual players who are right there, right now, and we can shift the story to suit them, as is the same is true of tabletop role-playing. But obviously, in the computer gaming thing, we have thousands and thousands of players. They might all be playing the game on their own. It might be a single story that they're playing through on their own. But we can't tailor it hugely to that individual player. There is reactivity. We can let them make choices. They can decide where to go. They can decide what to do. We can make them choose specific actions in the game that branch the story in some way. But in LARP or in tabletop, the story could go anywhere. In computer games, it has to be much more limited, because if they go left instead of going right, we need all the assets and the sound effects and the world design and everything for the going left. And as soon as you start branching further down that path and further down that path, you get into a combinatorial explosion of content needed to let the player go and do anything they want, wherever. Some games do as much as they can with that. Some of the big open world fantasy games or sci-fi games build whole worlds and try and give you lots and lots and lots of content for that. Some of the multiplayer games particularly, big online universes with thousands of players all at the same time, they do as much as they can to support that illusion, but it is still an illusion. Most of the games I work on are single player for a single player story experience delivered to one person. And so the key role, I guess, for me is to figure out how we involve the player in it rather than just showing them a story.
In the LARPing episode, we kind of spoke briefly about the creation of these kind of set pieces almost that are kind of dotted about this kind of overall experience. Is that a similar kind of process to how you go about kind of, you know, that initial kind of conceptualizing a game, or is it very dependent on per game? You know what I mean? Does it depend on the particular IP or that kind of thing?
Again, it completely depends. As with all these things, it completely depends. I know what my approach is, but there are also different points at which I might enter a game pipeline. If I am creating something from scratch or helping people create something from scratch, I do tend to go back first and foremost to what is the player fantasy. How are we trying to make them feel? Are we trying to make them feel like a detective? Are we trying to make them feel like a superhero? Once we come up with that, once we've got the player fantasy, how do we deliver that? In story moments, which are kind of like the set pieces you described, but also in the activities that they're taking part in and the agents that they have and the things that they poke to make things happen. How do we make that feel like a detective-y way to poke things and make things happen? How do we hit some of the cliches they're expecting from that genre? How do we do it in such a way that we don't have to explain everything about the world they're jumping into? How cliche do we keep it? How far do we navigate away? So yes, if designing it from scratch, my go-to is to start with player fantasy and then go through those moments, as we talked about in the last episode, moments that people will go, you should have seen that bit when that happened, that they'll be talking about afterwards. But equally, I might arrive to work on a game when in the general beats of the story have already been established, or when the main activities of how the player interacts with the game or interacts with the world already exist. And so then it tends to be about fitting the story around the framework that's already there, and figuring out how to get the most out of it given the limitations. And limitations might not just be, hey, somebody designed this wrong, but equally there might be, it's for a particular platform, it's a particular method of storytelling, or we've got to deliver 6 episodes in small chunks, or it's got to open up to publish some stuff on the web that's connected to the story, or there are all sorts of constraints and frameworks around this. In a pure world, though, I'd start with player fantasy.
What are the main challenges, do you think, when it comes to writing narratives for computer games?
Oh, main challenges. There are so many. So, at a much higher... If we can get the player fantasy right, that's great. At a much higher level, you tend to be creating games which have a very long story time, a very long play time of a core story, because the player will be doing things from time to time to time. And unlike watching a film, the player is going to be engaged in activities that are taking all of their focus. And during periods where they're deeply embedded in that kind of focused activity, they probably won't notice a story thing that happens. They'll probably be busy trying to push some buttons or make a thing happen, and they won't foreground. So getting the story into people's heads can be hard. Maintaining it over that period of play, which could be 130 hours, could be any kind of length, means that you have to deal with a lot of repetition, and you have to cope with the fact that when you're creating the story, you don't know if it's going to land until you can test the story. It's not like you can write a script for a film, hand it over to somebody to make it into a film, and sure, stuff will be done in editing, but you can see the complete story before you put it on film, potentially. Certainly a book, you just give them the book. But we don't know if the story will work and will hit the right emotional beats until we can play it, because so much of the story is not just about the words that get delivered or the concepts that get delivered. It's about how the player feels because of the things that they just did and the actions they themselves are doing. And that's really hard when you don't have all the assets of the game yet, you don't have all the art, you don't have all the audio, you just have a kind of framework structure of this stuff. And one of the things which persistently comes back is the idea where you'll be testing the game quite early on, and the report will come back that the player just has no idea what they're doing there, or how to get from point A to point B, or what their objective is, or all that kind of thing. And there's a tendency, for example, to drop in some extra sentences where a character talks to another sentence and go, oh, we should go up there, or whatever it is. And then the art comes in, and then the audio comes in. And with the art and audio in, suddenly it's blatantly obvious where the player should go and what they should be doing. And we've got this redundant line that still exists because that test said we needed it. And so there's this constant cycling and recycling and recycling. And I think one of the things I've struggled with conveying to starting writers, particularly if they come from other mediums, is that you do not write a perfect thing and deliver it. What you do is you write a thing that's just good enough, and then you refine and you refine and you refine, and you keep expecting almost everything you put in will be thrown away, will be cut, will be chopped, will be changed. That could be because the story isn't working, that could be because the gameplay wasn't fun for that segment, it could be that the player's just uninterested in that thing that you're trying to tell them. It could be that we run out of budget. There are or technical issues, like, no, we can't animate a character taking off a jacket, sorry, that just doesn't work using our game engine, so you're going to have another reason for that story point to happen. So much of it is about collaborative building and rebuilding with the whole team, rather than the kind of idealistic writerly view of, I shall write a script and I shall deliver it and that's my job done.
Going off that kind of collaborative process, if the story is interweaved with a game that's quite puzzle based or quite puzzle orientated, is that a you thing? Is that a puzzle designer, mechanic designer, or is that like again depend? All these answers are it depends. But like, how does that kind of? And I am assuming, you want that puzzle to be kind of in world. You don't want it to be this shocking, and now you're in a site, that kind of thing. So I guess the question is like, how does that kind of process work in that context?
It really depends what's leading the game. Some games come from a design perspective. They start with a game design, or they start with the game mechanics. Again, how will the player engage with the world? And those tend to be design-led, and then the story fitted around them, but trying to hide them within the world as a thing which is part of the world. That tends to be the way of almost everything that anybody does these days. But those tend to be design-led, and those puzzle designs will typically be tried out, and gameplay will experiment with them before you wrap a story around them, so that we know what we're working with. In some cases, games are driven story first. It's rarer. It's quite rare as a thing to happen. But if they're driven by story first design, then the likelihood is that the writer will hit, or the narrative designer will hit, a point in the story where the player needs to be blocked by something to continue in some way, or make a decision in some way, based on what happens in the world, and then it'll be a collaboration with the game designer team, with the design team, to say, okay, at this point we need some sort of puzzle or blockage or stoppage or challenge, and then we'll push backwards and forwards on what that could be and how we could clothe it in story, if that makes sense.
Every now and again there's these little squeaks and it's not me and it's not Julian, it is the dog.
She's now wanting attention after 2 hours on the podcast.
I'm just leaning down every now and again, just to kind of placate her. So the squeaks are the dog. In terms of then that kind of structure in traditional sort of writing, there's that hero's journey. Is there an equivalent within sort of games, that there are certain tropes that certain narrative games would follow, or are there new structures emerging as kind of games develop and as more and more games kind of become published?
So I rolled my eyes a bit there at the World's Hero's Journey. Apologies for that, but that's because it is a thing. So I know somebody who keeps one of those counters. It has been 0 days since somebody last mentioned the hero's journey. So
we've gone back to 0. Apologies.
No, it's fine. So I have my own problems with the hero's journey when it comes to film anyway, and TV. It's let's not go into huge detail on that. But structurally, some games can be said to follow that sort of shape. It's more often not used as a design tool or methodology. It's just things kind of can take that shape, or a shape that's a bit similar. When you're dealing with the notion of progression, which you are in a lot of computer games, where the player starts off with a set of abilities and gains more abilities, or gains more skill in those abilities, because they see the gameplay as growth, as overcoming challenges and facing bigger and bigger challenges. That part of the idea that the player is growing a character or growing a skill set until they hit a particular point, or until they hit the end of the game. That's definitely there in a lot of games. Structurally, though, they can be completely different. Games vary so much. They can be little chunks of story delivered piece by piece in variable orders, depending on what the player does, or not depending on what the player does. Or they can be entirely driven by which direction the player goes in, and what they want to explore, and what they want to make their game. There are games where you build cities. There are games where you build gardens. Most of the first-player story games tend to fit very broadly a 3-act structure, very broadly. By 3-act structure, I mean there's a beginning as we onboard them into the world. There's a middle bit, they run around and do a lot, and then there's an end. That's pretty much the shape. But again, because they are so long in gameplay, a lot of them, we tend to have a lot more climax, resolution, up, down, little peaks, little troughs, because we've got a lot more time that we're trying to fill with this. It's not just an hour and a half film. So they tend to be structured in a much shorter time frame, I guess.
Yeah, and I suppose it's sort of like how you can keep a player's attention, I guess, within the first X amount of hours of gameplay, and how you do that without, I guess, people, switching off and never picking up that game again.
And often it's the loop of play. So there tends to be you get people into okay, this is how I play and consume this game. In the old kind of game structures, it would be, I can complete 3 levels before I decide I'm going to go and have tea or whatever it is. So each level needs to deliver some sort of dopamine reward, I guess, which could be a chunk of story or somehow getting extra points to spend on your character, or both, or whatever they are. But if we're trying to run a narrative through this, we should be having some sort of story beat or story reward at the end of these quite small chunks of content. Again, each game varies, but you do tend to have to work on much shorter reward cycles, and then people for that game will go, okay, I get my rewards in this game delivered like this, and then you have to keep up that pattern, really, because they're then in the habit of it.
And when you are writing these narratives for the games, what does that kind of look like? Is that within a spreadsheet, or is that within like a document? How do you map that out? Because you did talk about kind of branching narratives and how, that could become exponential. I guess, how do you design or write that content so that it sort of makes sense to you, for one, and then when you're handing it over to someone else, with designers or whoever you're collaborating with, that it also sort of makes sense to them as well?
So this is going to be another of those answers. It all depends. Unfortunately, it all depends. So I think it's worth saying that there are very few mature tools for writing story in games, for dealing with branching structures. There are some not very good ones. There are some quite mature ones, but they are specific to specific companies. They're internal, like IP, and can't be used outside those companies. There are some which are great for one set of situations and useless for others. So it tends to vary wildly from project to project, or studio to studio, but actually mostly project to project. I use a collaboration of things. So there's several parts about writing, right? There's writing the words, and whatever pipeline you use to write the words and turn them into dialogue or whatever you're doing with them. There's also structuring the story and writing the story. And they are divergent things. They exist in different... They're different things to do, and often are being done by different people or different constellations of people. Designing the flow, the high overall flow of the story, I quite like doing that graphically. I use something called Miro to lay things out, which is basically a massive collaborative whiteboard. I quite like that to generally structure things, to test out that story before it actually gets anywhere near production. I'll often try and simulate that in, there's a tool called Inky, or by a company called Inkle, which are a game writing company, and it kind of goes into the old form of, if you remember the old choose your own adventure books, the kind of, here the player does this, okay, let's test this branch out, and so on. And you can get quite a rapid and cheap way of testing out a story like that, and that's good if you have the luxury of doing it. And then you have to break that down into essentially small chunks to communicate it to the rest of the team, and the graphical flow again can help. But the documentation, again, it depends completely on the team. But having the beat-by-beat reference and showing the relationships between them is really usefully done, again, graphically. but also just telling them the story in different forms, whether that's sitting everybody down through a PowerPoint and going, hey, here's the story I'm going to tell you, or whether it's large chunks of documentation. But broadly, I think having the graphical base really helps. Then actually writing the story. So writing takes loads of forms. Writing can be, let's talk about the contextual design of this level. So that could be briefing an art team or an audio team or whatever on what this level is about, what's the story about, what happened in this space, what are the sounds that we're likely to go, what's the mood we're trying to deliver for the player. So that that kind of contextual briefing is one sort of writing, or design, should I say. Then you have writing text which appears in the game. And again, completely depending on the game, that tends to be written or at least put into the game via simple tool sets. Often it's spreadsheets, as you say, or text files, or something very similar to that, and very basic kind of text. In some cases, you will write complicated text and design and work with desktop designers who will create beautiful lettered documents to go into your game, but still you want the raw text in as well because it needs to be localized, translated. And then writing dialogue, again, it completely depends. Some people write their dialogue in script format, some people write it in spreadsheets, depressingly. Excel is a really widely used tool in the industry because each element of text gets treated separately and has to be catalogued and translated and turned into sounds all separately, so you have to treat each individual line as if it's a thing on its own. Again, I use Inky for that at the moment, which is that the sort of choose your own adventure style system that I was talking about, which creates text files and lets you do flow. But there's loads of ways to do it, and there are some commercial tools for it again, but mostly they need to be tweaked for the particular game because each game does everything differently. A line in one game might be associated with a character portrait for the character who's speaking it, a colour for that character, a animation that has to trigger when that line happens. But that sort of system may be totally different from that game and another game. And another game, it might just be spoken language, nothing on screen. You just hear the voices over your speakers. So there's no standard at all. And there's a chunk of game development called pre-production where you're supposed to sit down and figure all this stuff out. How are we going to deliver story in this game and make sure that the pipelines are in place so when you start full production, you can just start pushing things into the machine. In reality, it never works, but pre-production is a great idea.
Can you tell us about a project that you've worked on that has been perhaps one of your favourites and why?
Oh, well, that's a difficult question.
I know.
Oh, lots and lots of games. So I think probably still my most favourite, because it's something that I had most attachment to and inception of, was a game called Amnesia Rebirth, which is a sequel to a horror game that came out a long time ago. And what was interesting about that one was so it was a first-person horror game that followed in quite a long tradition of the player not having any kind of way to fight back. It's about exploration, it's about mood, and it's about running and hiding and keeping out of the way of the terrible things. And what was interesting about that was our when we were working through really early ideas of the game, our lead artist came up with an interesting concept for it, because in previous games we had a particular type of protagonist, a particular type of experience, and he wanted to raise the stakes, and he said, well, what if this is we decided it was going to be in the desert, what if it's a pregnant woman? And starting from that point was really interesting, because it opened up a whole selection of things we could do about how you communicate the physicality of that to the player. And we decided, using some hand waving and and spooky effects, that time would pass in a slightly strange way, and she would get more pregnant as the game went on, and she got closer and closer to her goal. And so we were building this relationship between the player, the avatar they were controlling, obviously, who was being affected by these visceral changes, and the child. Actually, we quite strongly avoided the demon baby movie trope, which is what everybody would expect, and moved it into how the player character talks to this child, not directly talking or anything like that, but just kind of is sharing hopes, fears, dreams. This is the only other being that is around her and on her side and comforting her. And we worked out those conversations in a way where they would give the player character a level of health and respite as well, so that worked it in with the game mechanics. And the progression of how it became harder for the player to just move the character about, along with their attachment, the dream of what this child would one day become, and how we dealt with the actor in changing the sounds they were making as we went through the game. It was a fascinating process and a fascinating melding of the story and the experience, I think. So it's probably my favourite of the things I've worked on. All sorts of flaws with it, all sorts of things I would do different, but that is true of almost anything we do creatively, right?
Yeah. And then in terms of like games that you've played, what are like your kind of top 3 games that you kind of go,
dear.
I was trying to answer that question before I asked it. Like games that you kind of go, oh god, that is either genius because it does something really interesting narratively, or it's really interesting because it does something in terms of how it tells the story, maybe visually. Or again, you've talked a lot about how you design things that make people feel something quite specific. So kind of in the realms of those things, what has kind of really made an impact on you, and then I suppose how you then think about your own work and your own practice, and I suppose yourself as a player. I'm assuming you play games. What has had the most impact creatively and as you as a kind of player?
Ooh, okay. I'm just going to say Monkey Island because I always do. Secret of Monkey Island, out in, I don't know, 90 few, if that, was the first time that I'd played a game. It was a point-and-click adventure game. You were a pirate. But it was one of the very first games which was a world that it was fun to be in. It was everything was playing to the idiom of being a stupid wannabe pirate. It was no great mechanics now, but at the time was genius. You defeated people in sword fighting by insulting them rather than by being able to sword fight, and that was wonderful. And it taught me a bit about narrative mechanics, I think. These days, so there's a slight difference between things that I would normally play and things that I think are amazing. So there are a couple, 2 or 3 different classes of games, depending on who you talk to. They tend to be really big budget games, which we call AAA, things like Assassin's Creed, that sort of thing. At the other end of the spectrum are things that tend to get called indie games, independent publishers, or independent from publishers. And they are much lower budget, and partly because they're not driven by the sort of things that drive big publishers, a little bit like indie film, they get to experiment a lot more, and they do experiment a lot more with all sorts of concepts, ideas. And because tools to make games became a lot more accessible about 8-9 years ago, people are coming into the indie scene who don't have a technical background and are potentially coming from more creative areas. And so they try out things because people don't tell them they can't try out things. And some of them are commercial suicide and some of them are genius. And the bigger companies see those things and they go, oh, that's interesting. There's clearly a desire for that sort of thing. Maybe we can put it in our very big game. But that boiling pot has created all sorts of interesting things. So a couple of games. There's a game called Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons. Came out a bunch of years back. I think there's just been a remake, but I've heard that the remake really isn't very good. So if you can find the original, I don't want to spoil it, but it does something with its merging between gameplay mechanics and story that is genius. It just blows you away. It's well worth playing. It's not very long. One that's slightly easier to talk about, there's a game called Florence, which is a mobile game which tells the story of a relationship and a breakup through the medium of game mechanics with no words at all spoken. It's just different types of sort of puzzle games. That's really neat. There's another one called Unpacking, which again I think is mobile, but certainly it's a relatively short indie game where the story's entirely told through taking things out of boxes and putting them into a house. And each house or apartment or flat is different, and the things that you're unpacking is telling a different story. And they tell you again about somebody's life and their relationships through the medium of unpacking. Again, no words spoken. It's really, really nice. So mostly I think I'm saying the ones where you don't have words, they work better.
Less spreadsheets, right?
Well, yeah. Fewer spreadsheets. I mean, just a simple example on a much bigger scope game, bigger scale game. So there've been recently a few big games for Spider-Man made by the same company. And they absolutely nail the web slinging part of it. They are brilliant. You can swing through New York and it's just incredibly good. But they have this thing where Spider-Man obviously punches bad guys. And to punch bad guys, you press a particular key on the game controller. If you use that key when you're not near bad guys, when you're walking through the crowds of people in Manhattan or wherever, instead of it being a punch, it becomes a thumbs up or finger guns or an interaction with the people on the street who then react back to you. And it's brilliant because it absolutely nails that. You are the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. They absolutely get that. Just from that little change of, why don't we put it on the same button as punch? Players will probably try that. Oh, but then we're reinforcing that this is what happens, which is just a lovely, tiny grace note of work, really.
Yeah, I remember playing Florence for the first time, and it goes back to the conversations you've had with regards to LARPing and when we first asked the question about process of design. And it feels like it really did nail feel, like it's like the first 5 minutes of Up, when you get the whole story of the old guy and his wife who's passed away. You can't believe that within however long, it might not even be 5 minutes, but within that period of time, your feeling and emotions have just gone through the roof and then back down again. And Florence through. Yeah, like you say, almost like workshop craft kind of things. It's just something quite beautiful about that relationship between her and, I think from memory, her mum, and also like an ex kind of thing. So yeah, it's just, and it just looks beautiful as well.
Yeah, and the kind of like simplicity of it as well, and also from memory, things like you had to kind of brush your teeth and do those kind of daily monotonous things that we all do in life that was sort of intersected between the moments of like impactful parts of the story, and that kind of monotony of that as well was quite powerful.
Do you think two of those were mobile games, and obviously mobile probably by all accounts, depending on how you look at it, it's kind of more popular than console games in the sense of people having more access to them and things like that. And do you think it's kind of that glass screen has kind of pushed what games are even more? Do you think it, there's the obviously Call of Duty micro screened into a mobile phone, and it's just like it feels wrong. But then you have these kind of things like Florence that feel like they wouldn't have existed without mobile. You know, they feel like they are almost like, we talk a little bit about content fitting into someone's daily life. You know, like lunchtime or like a 5-minute thing here. You're not exactly going to take your Xbox, you know, on the train. Well, you might do, you know, on your commute. Do you feel like mobile's kind of like helped the industry, or do you feel like it's kind of more, not hindered it, but...
It's interesting. It's a different beast, and it's a different beast to design for. A little bit like we were talking about with the LARP, actually. It's a very different audience and a different mode that people are in. As you say, it's the 5-minute, 10-minute, you know, delivering 180 hours of story would never happen on a mobile. And there is obviously some adaptation. And I think there is an interesting thing that happens is when you say, oh, are you a gamer? Do you play games? And the person answers no, but I do Candy Crush, you know, or something like that. I think it has made it more common for people to be involved in, we can call them games, I think interactive activities, time spending activities on phones. And there are definitely some design features, particularly around accessibility, and I don't just mean making it easier for people who have particular needs, but I mean in making things bold and simple and straightforward and easy to jump into. I think some of those lessons have moved across into computer games. And interesting, you see some of the same thing feeding from board games as well. There's the tendency to go for icons for things rather than complicated conceptual things. Keep things really clear and accessible to read and understand, and short forms of text, those sort of things, I think, are partly driven by mobile. But there is some. It's a different medium again, and really the games which are successful on mobile phone have very little to do with the games that are successful on consoles. It's a different medium.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds kind of simple, but you know, just literally dealing with like glare on screen and the size of screen. You know, you're being on the outs, your thumb predominantly being the only like way of manipulating, or shake, or you know, with those kind of things. You know, gyroscope obviously kind of help, but it is totally. Yeah, it's interesting how people lump everything together, but there are so many different kind of mini categorizations, and even like you said, even within the computer industry of indie, AAAs, all that kind of stuff. There's still people comparing and the same thing for the same thing. They're kind of still kind of like going, they're still comparing an indie game with a AAA. I think that will get more and more. Well, do you think it will get more and more as things like Unreal Engine start allowing indies to kind of maybe look, or like, I'm not saying it's as good, but look like AAAs? Do you think that's helpful?
So
that, I mean?
That is interesting. That there is a tech convergence for sure. I mean, the mobile industry is driven by Unity and Unreal, and the same is true about pretty much anything now. Still, some of the big companies have their own platforms, but mostly they're driven by Unreal and Unity, which means a lot of commonality of tools and things like that. I think the idea that indie games can push more and more towards AAA is a bit of a red herring, actually. Of course, it is possible to use higher and higher quality assets and pull things together faster. But the effort that is required still to do high quality in everything, through animation to texture detailing to sound, is still huge, and every release of games requires that to be up and up and up, and it is a millstone around the AAA industry's throats, actually. And Unreal is helping mitigate that a bit, but it's really hard. Indie games have always prevailed at being stylized, at coming up with something that is peculiar to the game they're making, at coming up with something which is simplified or cartoony or artistically very interesting, and those tend to have been the things, or part of the things, which have made that game sing and made it stand out. And if everything looks like a Call of Duty shooter, but you could buy this indie game that looks like a Call of Duty shooter, or you could buy that Call of Duty shooter, you'd buy the Call of Duty one, because they are the experts at that stuff. However, if you gave me a game which was not trying to ape those bigger titles, if you like, but was doing its own thing and doing it well, then I'd be interested. So it's in this marketplace, it's always about what catches attention, right? And yeah, if you take your own path and go for your own appearance, sound, whatever your shtick is, you're much more likely to stand out.
Yeah, because I remember, quite a few years back now, was it Everything? Where you became lots of different elements within a world. So you might start as an animal, and the animals obviously kind of rolled around, didn't they, like that? And then you could then change your perspective to be as small as like a cell, or you could go even bigger and then go to become something in space. That was a really interesting game that I think was on Steam. I think it was called Everything.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
And that it was unlike anything I'd ever really played before, but it was simple yet really kind of quite magical in many ways. And then you had the kind of Alan Watts sort of mapped on
bits of text,
at different times. And I guess the longer you played it, the kind of more you, I don't know, became attached to maybe some of the messaging within that game about, we are all connected. And there was actually kind of something quite yogic about it in terms of like its sort of philosophy, and how, those games can affect you on a very, very different level. But in its simplicity, in terms of the gameplay, you just become one thing, and you either become smaller or bigger than that thing. And what was the other game I was thinking of that? What Remains of Edith Finch?
Yeah.
That one, again, in terms of its storytelling and narrative, and actually switching perspective at times. I think at one point you became a cat, didn't you? And you could leap around the branches. Something very kind of Alice in Wonderland quality. But this sort of, it cloaked really heavily in mystery. I think again that had a very unique, not only narrative but then also kind of like twists and turns within it that really captured your imagination.
I really liked it. I wasn't so hot on the framing narrative, but the little individual vignettes were great. I'm going to call it the fish chopping game. The mix of mechanics and storytelling there was fantastic. And those things would be very unlikely to be tried out by a AAA game. Very unlikely.
It feels a lot of synergies with, as you described earlier, about what feel am I trying to impart, but equally, particularly with something like Everything and in a way Florence as well to some degree, where they're almost meditative.
Yes.
And it feels like almost, whether that was by design, it would be interesting to know, but whether it's almost instead of feel, but alongside feel, there was also this desire to make a meditative experience, which feels wild that someone would decide to do that, but it definitely did work. And I definitely felt, in some ways, I'm thinking Florence particularly, I felt like I'd been all consumed, but not in like a lots of flashing lights kind of way.
Yeah, and I think those everything in What Remains of Edith Finch, particularly for me, I came away with a feeling rather than a sense of any story. It was very much I've come away with a feeling, and actually it doesn't really matter to me that I don't know the beginning, middle and end. It was enough of an experience to have that sort of felt response in the gameplay than above everything else.
Yeah, and I think that's the core thing that I'm trying to drum into people, really, for me, from a design perspective, is we talked about the player fantasy, but the how do you want them to feel should be the key driving design feature of not only the whole game, but every level, every dialogue, every that should be the thing which drives it. And I think that's sometimes the case, and that's sometimes still not the case. But if every department is working together to make them feel a particular way, then it works really well. And there's some really good collaboration which can come out of that. There's a tendency, and I'll call them kind of old school directors to or creative directors particularly to deliver a vision. It's got to be like this. And so you give a set of instructions to the art team and a set of instructions to the audio team or whatever it is. But you're not a brilliant artist or a brilliant sound designer. So giving them instructions isn't actually very helpful. Giving them a goal, make the player feel sad, or whatever it is, tends to work much better. Proper collaboration rather than giving a recipe to the people who you see as your underlings, I guess, is the trick.
It feels like it's very similar to genre for a shorthand. We kind of discussed this before on another podcast, where if I say to you, there's these people, if they touch you, they infect you, then you become infected, and so on and so on. And I go to you, it's a zombie game. You understand, because you understand the genre and things like that. You understand implicitly the rules around it, and it sounds like feel is almost that shorthand to understanding the rules of. Oh, I understand how to make sad. I understand how to make happy. I understand how to make, whatever that might be.
I think that's true. But actually, genre. So there's a couple of things about genre which are kind of interesting, I think. One is, because you have so little time to explain the rules of a world to a player who has just stepped into that world, it's in your favour to use cliche and trope and genre as much as possible. The kind of classic example I go to that one is you see the start of the film or the game or whatever, and there is somebody in the forest wearing, I don't know, vaguely homespun clothing, and they have pointy ears. Therefore, dragons exist. Magic exists. As soon as you see the pointy ears, you have built in the player's head an entire model of what this world is and how it works, just by adding a pointy ear. If you didn't mean for pointy ears to mean that, then remove the pointy ears. Right? And I think that's it's both a problem and an opportunity for games in that they do tend to stick in very well understood genres, because then you don't have to teach the player lessons about how to behave in this world. Not only how does the world work, but also in the idioms of the world. This is a superhero story, so I can probably fall off a very large building, right? Whereas this is a realistic London gangster movie or game. If I fall out of a window, I've got a big problem, right? It's pulp action adventure. I can be shot 30 times and everything will be fine. Or, so it's the trick, I think, is deviating from those, setting those broad brushstrokes and then deviating from them, which makes them not just cliche. And that's interesting. And then the second bit, to talk about genre just briefly, is the shorthand that you need to use between different departments to explain a particular scene or sequence or thing you want to go for. And there's a kind of purist's angle to this, which is don't do it. And I prefer people in the team to understand what the heck you're trying to do. So if you say, this is like that bit in Aliens when... And hopefully enough people in your team have watched Aliens to go, oh, I get it. And the trouble is, I'm now at an age where I'm using film examples where people go, never heard of that. And it's kind of, oh God. I'm keen on, which means I have to keep up to date with modern media. I have to watch so much modern media. Or I have to go, no, this sequence they're doing is exactly like this thing. You should watch it.
You need to watch this,
Yeah.
But having common reference points in the team is really important, just as a way of being able to communicate it. If I'm talking about characters to other people, to the rest of the team, finding reference characters who are kind of like that or kind of fulfill that role in the story. So I tend to try to find 4 or 5 examples of a reference character for a particular character, so that hopefully people will know at least one of them.
You're like this, aren't you? No, they didn't know this one. They didn't know this one. This is my last chance.
Pre-1980, we are absolutely...
Yeah. Oh, there's this brilliant example of this thing in this film. I think about only 5 people ever saw the film when it came out. How the heck am I going to explain that one?
What's the one, the TH...
Oh, THX by George Lucas. Yeah. There were 3 people that watched that. Yeah.
When we've ever mentioned it, people are like, what?
Yeah.
It's like, and then we kind of go, actually, don't watch it because it's really quite weird and disturbing.
I think that was the whole of the 80s, wasn't it? But there we go.
I think so. We were talking about that earlier, actually, how we've been shaped by some quite kind of dark narratives in terms of, we were talking about Watership Down and also Dumbo, oh my God. Yeah.
And most of British TV in the 70s and 80s was, going back to Mr. Nosybonk, but there was things like Chucky, if you came across that sort of thing, or Z for Zachariah, or The Day of the Triffids.
Oh, Z for Zachariah, yes.
Yeah,
we studied that
bleak.
in school. Yeah. Well, I guess, around that time, it's sort of like the atomic bomb and that nuclear anxiety was absolutely rife. I remember as a kid I would have, and I must have been about 7 or 8, I would have a recurring nightmare of bombs dropping. I think because at the time you're just so fed with this sort of period of time,
That's all right. We're getting back to it.
So I feel
all we're
right
familiar
at home.
soon.
Yeah,
there's definitely the cycles are 100% true, aren't they? With that.
Yeah, absolutely. Cycles of things that come back and forth. Well, the point I was going to say earlier, you kind of then got games like Stardew Valley, where that does quite a lot of different things. One, I often just play it because it's quite meditative, and you can just plant your crops and not really do anything else beyond that. Maybe you get a few little interruptions or invitations to go and do something else, or you can, full on do all of the tasks that are available to you that day, that are rewarding, but also some of them are really, really frustrating. So just in terms of like how one game could make you feel, that has multifaceted elements to it, where yes, I could feel very meditative and I plant my crops and I'm having a great time, or I can go into town and go and find whoever and wish them a happy birthday, or join the seashell festival, whatever it is, or go mining and be absolutely just so irate at the end of it because you've not achieved it and you've got killed multiple times because either you've gone too deep and you've run out of the daytime, or you get killed by those horrible monsters. But how when you talk about designing games to make people feel certain things, I guess there's almost also a journey of different emotions that game could absolutely elicit in different players, depending on how the game is structured. That's our camera dying. How the game is structured. There it is. Good night. How the game is structured to elicit lots of different emotions, or how the game is structured to enable you to do lots of different things and give you that agency or permission to play it in a certain way as you see fit, because there's different elements to it that allow, the design allows you to play it in different ways.
But it is a thing. I mean, Stardew Valley, I guess, is a bit of an edge case because it's been designed by one person, designed and created by one person. And they have the ability to take that wherever they want to. As we move into bigger games, again into AAAs and things like that, there is definitely a tendency to go, we need to have all sorts of activities available. Like we were talking about when we were talking about LARP, people who prefer puzzles or people who prefer physical action or whatever. When you get into bigger games, particularly multiplayer games, the multiplayer games, because they're server based, they're trying to keep people engaged and they're trying to keep people coming back constantly. So they're trying to build worlds where people can find a niche for themselves and something that they want to do and something they want to spend time coming back and doing. So the sort of variety you get in something like Stardew Valley is unusual in that scale of game. I often prefer, I enjoy Stardew Valley, but I often prefer for a story-driven game. Stardew Valley is a game where you can go and find story and be pulled into it, but a story-driven game, my preference is to avoid a lot of the extra clutter and do something that is quite tight and focused. Partly because I think there is a trope which happens in big open world story games where there is a terrible cataclysm of some sort that's about to come. The world is threatened. I'm just going to go and pick berries for the next few days and ignore that and go off and do something off at the side. So it depends what story you're trying to tell, of course, but...
Is that because that's too close to the truth then?
Possibly.
Like,
yeah, there is that. There is that.
Everyone's like, well, okay, just do my own thing over here. Yeah, it's quite interesting. Yeah, it is humanity in microcosm. Absolutely. I've got 2 questions. Trends and future. They might be they might be the same question really, but I guess this year. At the start of the year, I kind of like two games really blew up. One being Pal World and one being Helldivers 2. Like two that I think what's interesting about them is, and it's kind of from some work we've been doing, generally looking at R&D and innovation, generally about this idea of very small, points of iteration to change something. And it feels like those 2 games in particular are this kind of archetype of every single IP you could ever imagine smashed together. And, like somehow you've got Pokemon, you've got Rust, and you've got this thing over here. And then you've got Helldivers, which is probably Starship Troopers, Warhammer 40,000, Mandalorian in it, and stuff like that. Just like loads of things in it. So I just wondered do you feel, are there particular trends that you're seeing within the games that you're kind of seeing now or experiencing that are people, I guess the reason I brought that up is it's almost like the IPs they're using are almost shortcutting the genre thing that we've been discussing. So it's almost like they're going, oh, you're familiar with this, you're familiar with this, you're familiar with this, therefore you've got to enjoy this. And I just wondered if there's any trends that you're seeing that, being a bit more closer to like making, that you see might feel like becoming in the future. I
don't know, because the breadth of industry is quite hard to see when you're down in it. Helldivers, I thought, was basically Starship Troopers, and a good job of that, and making making it very accessible. But it's basically Starship Troopers. It has an interesting feature where its campaign is being responded to by the dev team and replied to and driven by the players, responded to by the dev team, which is almost GMing again. So that live connection is interesting, and it's something that I did a bit of work on a couple of years ago, and something I'd like to see more of. Whether it'll actually happen, I don't know. From a story point of view, there is much more interest, has been for a bunch of years now, but it's growing, in getting away from traditional story structures, which are things which have wrapped games for quite some time now. That's the cat screaming in the background.
In agreement.
In agreement.
Yes.
So there is a lot of from my point of view, there's lots of interesting stuff happening around. Not necessarily generated stories, but non-linear stories that are not a traditional kind of branching system. So things which are very highly dependent on what the player did will result in another choice of a chunk of story, storylit systems and similar. And I'm seeing quite a lot of that, and I'm seeing quite a lot of that filter up from indie experiments or smaller games into bigger kind of open world games. I think at the high end we're going to push more and more into bigger and bigger always on worlds, and that's both a blessing and a curse, I think. There will inevitably be lots of people seeing what they can get out of AI in its various forms, and that's not just in generative AI, but in it actually makes life way easier for motion capture and way easier for potentially on device changing things around based on what the player's done. And despite the fact there's a huge movement against replacing creatives with AI, I think pretty much inevitably people are going to start experimenting both at small scale and at large scale with what we can get out of AI systems. That's probably going to be the biggest change in what we see over the next 5 years or so.
Cool.
And how do you use that for storytelling, which is an interesting question. Can it tell anything other than something terrible? Who knows? Can it generate a whole load of NPCs to talk to and characters to interact with? Probably. Will they be compelling in any way? Don't know. There are lots of examples of it that you can laugh at the moment, but given that the pictures that AI created was utter nonsense only 2 years ago, I think it's
just a tad better now, isn't it?
It's going to change things a bit. It's going to upend things.
Can it introduce more personalisation to that player's, experience, just as you were talking about in terms of
the choices
that they make and how you design LARP to make them feel like it's been in some degree tailored to them? Is that a potential?
Or will it get us all out of a job? Who knows? Or does the job become about carefully crafting the parameters of an AI and teaching it how to be a particular character or something to make it compelling? Don't know.
It feels like there's definitely that element of there's definitely that kind of AI prompt engineer kind of feel that kind of feels like it could exist across a lot of industries where someone is literally, like you say, working with the engine and just very good at crafting the output somehow through very good prompting and linking things together with other bits. And because I think as you said, with the imagery, the one-off image is fantastic. A series of images that feel the same is very hard, particularly if it's got a character in, a character.
You say that, but there are now whole video sequences being created from text.
Yeah.
So,
it's definitely gonna change for sure. Interesting times.
Back to the 80s, everyone. Back to the 80s.
When there was VHS. Oh, fantastic.
Is there anything you want to add before anything you feel like you've missed that you're like, oh God, I wish I'd said that somewhere?
I suppose the only thing which I keep coming back to is I've had a haphazard checkered career across a whole bunch of different things, and an awful lot of what I learn has been from things I've done in my career, but also just random interests like go and study traditional storytelling or build props or go and do street games or amateur theatre or whatever it is. What I find interesting about computer games is the nexus that it is for all of these things. Almost everything that I have learned in some way that seemed utterly unconnected at the time I learned it connects in, whether it is a particular historical random fact which suddenly matters to the game artist who's trying to make one of the things that you surprisingly learned about 50 years ago, or whether it's about I understand it just enough on how to make art to talk to the art team properly, or just enough about how sound is done or animation is done because I've tried it, to be able to talk to the animation team about it. And that's what I found really interesting about the medium, is it is the intersection of so many things, which I see a little bit in cinema, but nothing like to the same extent.
So diversify.
Yeah.
Yes.
Try stuff out.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I guess
you
still
never
be
know when
that.
it might be useful. Yeah.
Yeah. Continue being a student for your whole life, isn't it? Always learning.
Mm.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, on that note,
Thank
thank
you
you
very
so
much.
much.
No worries.
Ta-da!
You've been listening to Crafted Reality with me, Ali John, and my partner in crime, Julian Sykes. If you did like this episode, please remember to like and share with anyone you think might be interested. See you again soon.
Thanks for watching.